Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Welcome back to me. This is my first time recording since I got back from our Central European tour, which was amazing. We saw some incredible history. I had an awesome group, loved hanging out with each and every one of them, each and every one of you, if you're one of the people watching this that was on that tour. So we'll have some more to say about upcoming tours and other things that are going on in the very near future. But in the meantime, it's time to dive back in to some geography. I think geography is a very unique lens through which to view history. And the channel Geography by Jeff has a video called Why the U.S. is Really 12 Nations, Not 50 States. It showed up in my recommended. I thought that was an amazing idea for a video because understanding the cultural and economic and other differences that exist between different parts of the country helps us understand why history has happened the way that it has. So I'll put a link down in the description to the original so you can check it out. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Is how the United States refers to itself, but in reality, this isn't correct. In fact, within the United States, there are 12 competing regions that have their own cultures, values, and priorities. And
it's going to be interesting because it looks like I live right on the border of one of those, and I think that's probably accurate.
These regions really act more like independent nations under a single flag. So what are the 12 nations of America? The United States has long been viewed as a single nation, a union of states under one flag and one constitution. But beneath the surface lies something deeper. America isn't one nation, it's 12. I'm not the first person to notice this either. Journalist Colin Woodard originally proposed 11 American nations in his book, American Nations. But what I've done is expanded his nations to reflect two major changes: the inclusion of Hawaii as its own unique nation, and the creation of a Spanish Caribbean nation that includes both southern Florida and Puerto Rico, both areas that are distinct from the nearby regions. So with that said, let's get to the nations. If you were to look at a cultural map of the United States, you'd see something very different from the one you learned in school. Instead of state lines, you'd see 12 fluid, overlapping territories stretching across traditional borders and sometimes even national ones.
So it's really interesting to me, for example, that they've got northern Appalachia reaching all the way up into like Ashtabula County here in Ohio, including all of the area of Pennsylvania except the Philadelphia region. I don't know that that's accurate. For example, where I live, I wouldn't really consider where I live specifically to be kind of Appalachian by culture, but you go about a half hour south of me and that's absolutely true. When you get down to like where my church is, definitely Appalachia. There's a southern accent there that doesn't exist where I am, and it's only a 40-minute drive to my church, and it's a completely different culture there. That's how quickly it can change.
But for this video, we're going to focus just on the nations within the United States, starting in the Northeast. Rooted in New England and stretching into upstate New York, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota is the nation of Yankeedom.
So this is kind of interesting because as I think about this historically speaking, if you just think about, for example, the original 13 colonies, obviously we all know that historically there's a huge divide between North and South. And a lot of that, I think, is based in large part on the fact that the North, especially the New England states, were heavily settled by people from England, whereas once you get into like Southern Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, you're talking about a lot of Scots-Irish, as we call it in the States. A lot of people from Scotland, a lot of people from Northern Ireland, and then eventually even the Irish, which many of them settle in places like Boston and New York. So the Scots-Irish are really kind of that Protestant Scottish descent group that brings a lot of that fierce independence and mistrust of big government and all that stuff that we've seen ever since. But over here, more when you get like Michigan, for example, heavily settled by people from Western New York. So you see a lot of similar names to like the Finger Lakes region of New York and then in Eastern Michigan. But then up here, you get into this area and you're talking about a lot of like Scandinavians and German, people of German ancestry, which also settled central Ohio. So I'll be interested to hear this fleshed out a little more.
Map, it hugs the northeastern part of the US and most of the Great Lakes. Centered around New York City and parts of northern New Jersey and the Hudson Valley is the nation of New Netherlands. Moving south in central Pennsylvania.
And that goes back to it originally being New Amsterdam, New York. And so you have Dutch settlers on the Hudson Valley. That's why you see a lot of like Dutch names. The area around Philadelphia was settled. It was originally New Sweden. There were a lot of Swedish names that you're going to see there.
And heading westward across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and parts of Iowa and Missouri is the Midlands.
So this is kind of interesting. First of all, it's kind of cool because my family came from the Midlands in England. I grew up in Trumbull County, Ohio, which is the blue one right here. But I live in Mahoning County, which is only about 15 minutes away from Trumbull County. But we're considered part of the Midlands. Kind of interesting. But really, honestly, then south of me, Columbiana County, that's Appalachia.
Found along the Chesapeake Bay in eastern Virginia and parts of Maryland
like
and North
Tidewater.
Carolina is the nation of Tidewater.
Yeah.
It resembles the remnant of old colonies along the Atlantic. West of Tidewater is Greater Appalachia, a broad, rugged band that stretches from the hills of western Pennsylvania down through West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and Tennessee.
See, I would absolutely, these Ohio River counties, we're talking like, and I know I'm focused heavily on this because this is what I know. Columbiana, Jefferson, Harrison County, Belmont County, those areas, they're Appalachia. They're 100% Appalachia. And I know because my family on my grandma's side came from there.
To Arkansas and parts of Texas. Moving south once more and dominating much of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and parts of Louisiana and Texas is the Deep South.
Yeah.
In the far south and consisting of southern Florida, especially Miami, and Puerto Rico, is the Spanish Caribbean nation. Tucked in between the Gulf of Mexico and the Deep South nation is the nation of New France. Moving westward, spanning from southern...
Yeah, and he's saying that because you still have a lot of people like Creole, which is this kind of hybrid that's based in the French-speaking people who settled that area. And you see some very unique things there in like Louisiana, like New Orleans, that you don't see in other parts of the South.
Southern California and Arizona across New Mexico and into West Texas is the nation of El Norte. North of El Norte and covering a vast...
So we're talking about kind of North Mexico, right? There's a lot of people of Hispanic descent, of Mexican descent specifically.
Swath of interior California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, parts of western Texas and the Dakotas, and much of mainland Alaska is the Far West nation. In the far north and west is the left coast, a narrow but powerful strip along the Pacific, stretching from the San Francisco Bay.
The left coast is kind of what we in more rural conservative America call that area, because if you look at maps of how the country votes, you'll notice that other than pockets in some big cities, most of the blue parts of America are on the two coastlines.
Area up through Portland and Seattle and into the Alaska archipelago. And finally, thousands of miles away from the mainland is the nation of Hawaii.
I would agree that
These
Hawaii
12
is definitely very uniquely its own thing.
nations have different politics, cultures, values, and social trends, and they don't follow state boundaries, which were often arbitrarily made at the time and didn't really factor in how actual cultures might develop. For this reason, the American nations expand beyond in ways that we're not really accustomed to. Which brings us to the geography and history of each nation.
Interesting.
Where people settled and how they came to shape the land are at the heart of how each nation came to be.
I agree.
The cultural lines that define these 12 nations don't align with modern state borders, because that's not how nations are actually formed. Look at Europe.
And if you, I was just about to say, if you want to look at an example of why that's a bad idea, look at Europe and even look at the Middle East and how some of the lines, the borders were drawn that didn't really take into consideration the cultural sensitivities and the languages and the religions that were involved.
For example, each country looks organic rather than the artificial straight lines that make up the individual states.
Yeah, but even in that case, you've got some cultural differences. I mean, North Germany and Bavaria are very different places. And Paris is very different than Eastern France. And parts of England are very different from one another.
This is because they follow linguistic and cultural borders that were formed over hundreds of years.
Somewhat.
Because of this, each nation in the United States similarly grew from a distinct historic root, which was influenced by its surrounding landscape. Here's how the geography and history shaped each nation. Yankeedom emerged from the Puritan colonies of New England, Settlers arrived seeking a religious utopia and quickly organized around towns, churches, and schools. The geography, rocky soil, dense forests, and harsh winters wasn't ideal for large plantations, but perfect for close-knit, self-sufficient communities. This created a legacy of town halls, universities, and civic institutions that still defines the region today.
If you're an American and you've never been to New England, go there. It feels like a different world than the parts of the United States that sprouted up later, like where I live in Northeast Ohio. Even though where I live is originally the Connecticut Western Reserve, and so we have a lot of names that are similar. And there are some parts of the former Connecticut Western Reserve, like in northern Trumbull County, that maybe resemble it a little bit. It's different. I mean, the way the churches are built are different. The way the towns are laid out is different. The culture is different. It's very interesting to see how incredibly different that part of the country could be from even where I live a few hundred miles away.
Even as far west as the state of Minnesota. Meanwhile, New Netherlands was originally founded by the Dutch as a commercial trading post and grew in the sheltered natural harbor around modern-day New York City. Because of its unique geography, New Netherlands encouraged maritime trade, immigration, and urban density. The Dutch legacy of religious tolerance, multiculturalism, and commerce remains central to its character today. And then there's the Midlands, with its rolling hills, fertile farmland, and navigable rivers. The Midlands were settled by English Quakers and German immigrants who envisioned a pluralistic, agrarian, middle-class society, primarily focused on the colony of Pennsylvania, but encompassing places as far west as Missouri and Iowa.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to look at migration pattern maps because, for example, where I live, again, it's kind of my point of reference I keep using, heavily settled by Pennsylvania Dutch, as we call that, which were Germans that settled Pennsylvania. And you can kind of see the pattern where they go from like Berks County in eastern Pennsylvania and they migrate west to places like York and Dauphin County in the central part of the state, and then eventually to Washington County, which is outside of Pittsburgh. And then from there, they came up into Northeast Ohio. And there's a very distinct pattern that happens there. Likewise, you go south and you can see clear, distinct migration patterns from places like North Carolina and Virginia into eastern Kentucky after the Revolution when all these guys got land grants.
Its geography lent itself to family farms, and its central location helped it evolve into the political swing region of the United States. Tidewater developed along the Chesapeake Bay and eastern North Carolina. Its wide, navigable rivers and access to the Atlantic made it ideal for plantation agriculture and transatlantic trade. This region was settled by English gentry, and its flat coastal plains supported a hierarchical society based on tobacco, enslavement, and exporting agriculture for wealth. The rugged Appalachian...
Yeah, he mentions they're exporting agriculture for wealth. Remember that in the early centuries of the American South especially, most people were subsistence farmers, which meant you were growing what you needed to survive. You weren't growing crops to sell to make a profit. But there were these plantations that sprouted up selling what they called cash crops, like tobacco, for example, or cotton, which were not things you could consume. You know, you can't live on tobacco, but you can sell tobacco for a profit and then live off of that money. And so that's why you see slavery become so ingrained in the South for these cash crops, especially cotton.
Mountains, of course, define Greater Appalachia. This nation is isolated and heavily forested in the east, but rich in natural resources. Originally settled by Scot-Irish frontiersmen, Greater Appalachia developed a fiercely independent culture shaped by subsistence farming and clan loyalty.
Yeah, he's dead on this, and I'm really happy to hear how he has focused in on some of this stuff, because that's exactly what I said earlier about what defines the South, and this is so important in understanding things like the American Civil War, or understanding why the South now is very pro-Republican, who for most of the last few decades has been kind of anti-big government, though that seems to be shifting some now. Or even the things like the Hatfields and McCoys, or the Holbrook-Underwood feud, or all these other feuds that happened in places like Kentucky, West Virginia, Eastern Tennessee. It all goes back to who settled this area, the Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish by their nature, are kind of like looking at with a side eye toward like the big government in London. And so that transferred over here to the big government in Washington. And the clan warfare of the Highlands in Scotland came over to the Highlands of America and became something similar. It's all exactly why these people are the way that they are. And I say these people, these are my people. And the isolation is why you have a lot of intermarriage between families over generations, like the same families. My great-great-grandmother, for example, had a brother and a sister. She married a guy. Her brother married that guy's sister. So she and her brother married a brother and a sister to each other. And then their other sister married their first cousin. So between the 6 of them, there were 2 last names before they got married. I hope you followed all that. The isolation causes a very particular mindset to unfold. And that's why you think of things like people sitting on their porch with a shotgun if you come near their property, because they're used to that. They're used to being isolated.
The mountains both isolated the region and protected its traditions. This rough and tough rural mentality extended as far west as northern Texas. Formed by slaveholding elites in the South, the Deep South's flat, humid coastal plains and river deltas were perfect for cotton and sugar plantation.
And this is where you see the majority of the enslavement happening pre-Civil War, especially in places like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, because it's perfect climate and conditions for that.
This geography enabled a brutal plantation economy supported by enslavement, which in turn gave it its distinct African American culture today. Its original aristocratic culture, racial caste system, and economic inequality can be traced back to this colonial foundation. Southern Florida and Puerto Rico form the Spanish Caribbean nation. This region is tropical, coastal, and deeply influenced by Caribbean migration and trade, and the Spanish language. Spanish colonial roots, Catholicism, and African Caribbean cultural influences are strong here, especially in cities like Miami and San Juan.
And if you think about this too, think about how, depending on which region you live in, you tend, like I understand the Appalachian culture because I've been connected to it for so long, and I even live really close to it. I understand that Midlands culture because that's where I've grown up and lived most of my life. I don't understand the Southern Florida and that Caribbean culture because I've never really had much exposure to it. And so that can cause us then, when we don't understand a culture, when we don't know many people from that, to start to form assumptions about them and start to maybe have prejudices toward those groups of people. And maybe you grew up in a place where for you, the Appalachian culture is like you don't understand it, you don't get it, you think those people are backward, they marry their cousins, and they don't really have much to offer the world. You know, we all kind of feel that way about other groups.
This geography makes it the prime gateway between the US and Latin America. New France is tucked geographically at the mouth of the Mississippi, making it unusually small, but united by its French heritage. The Mississippi River and bayous enabled trade and settlement by the French and later Creoles. Because of this historic settlement pattern, Catholicism, language, and cuisine make it distinct from the Deep South. Spanning deserts, mountains, and the fertile valleys from Southern California to Texas and into Southern Colorado is El Norte. Because of its geographic location, the Spanish were actually the first Europeans here.
That actually, I'm glad he pointed that out too, because, and I don't know a ton about the Spanish, the Hispanic population of Colorado, but I know that it's distinctly there. Spent a lot of time in Colorado, and you know, that's not something that me as somebody in Northeast Ohio ever really thought much about. That really isn't just kind of like on the borders, that it really does stretch up into Colorado, up as high as Denver.
Establishing missions, presidios, and ranches long before English settlers arrived on the East Coast. Its borderland identity is shaped by bilingualism, Catholicism, and resilience to an overwhelmingly arid environment. Dominated by the Rocky Mountains, the Great Basin deserts, and Arctic tundras of Alaska, the Far West was the last American region to be settled in large numbers. Its harsh environment required massive government infrastructure, from dams and railroads to military bases and eventual airports, to support human settlements. Even today, it's a land of low population and high federal presence because
Yeah.
the federal government actually owns most of its land.
I was going to say, if you look at a map, look at how much of the West is still owned by the federal government. Why? Because it was settled last, and it is. It's just not something where people can go on their own like they could in a place like Eastern Kentucky and clear out a farm and make a living for themselves. It's much harder to do that there.
The left coast is where rugged mountains meet the mighty Pacific Ocean and encompass the coastal areas of Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and the Alaskan Panhandle.
Beautiful area.
Settled first by Yankees and later by global immigrants, its culture fuses Eastern reformism with Western libertarianism. And its geography, temperate climate, seismic activity, fertile valleys, and vast forests encouraged experimentation, progressivism, and innovation. And finally, as an isolated volcanic archipelago, Hawaii's geography is unlike any other U.S. region.
And it's kind of halfway between the United States and Japan for most of the U.S. population. And if you go there, heavily Japanese culture. Of course, you also have the Polynesian culture that is there. And so it's a really, really unique mix of places.
Settled by Polynesians and later transformed by American missionaries and Asian laborers, its culture reflects Pacific traditions, Asian fusion, and deep ties to the ocean. The island's isolation helped preserve indigenous identity even amid colonization, meaning Hawaiian is a common language to this day. Geography and history is embedded within each nation, and each continues to evolve because of these lines today. The United States has always struggled to define what it is: a melting pot, a patchwork, a union, an experiment. But one thing is increasingly clear: it has never truly been one single nation.
Oh, for sure.
It's a federation of cultures, worldviews, and identities that have coexisted, sometimes uneasily, under the same flag.
And it's important for us to acknowledge that that is not uniquely American. That's true of many countries, as I said earlier.
That reality becomes easier to see when you stop thinking in terms of states or party lines and start thinking in terms of deep-rooted cultural regions. Take a look at the way Americans behave politically as an example. National elections often hinge on so-called swing states. But when you zoom in closer, it's the swing regions
Right.
within those states that actually move the needle. The blue cities of Yankeedom clash with the red rural counties of Greater Appalachia, sometimes within the same state.
Yeah.
Southern Florida historically voted nothing like the Florida Panhandle, though that trend has changed recently due to shifting political ideologies of Cuban migrants and
That's absolutely true, and it's true where I live as well. I live in a heavily blue, traditionally blue part of Ohio that has been going increasingly red over the last few presidential elections.
a growing retiree population. And far northern California has little in common with Los Angeles. It's this cultural geography that tells the real story. These nations are not based on modern trends or media bubbles. They're grounded in centuries of history, and these differences aren't superficial either. They explain why Americans often seem to be speaking past each other,
Yep.
locked in a cultural Cold War.
Well, because we are in, I mean, even as I talk about often the idea of being in kind of an echo chamber. We live in echo chambers, many of us. A lot of us live in parts of the country where most people vote the same way we do and believe the same way we do. And so we don't often get exposed to people with differing views because we're just not around anybody else like that. I grew up, for example, in a small town where I had 88 students in my graduating class, and we were like 99.9% white. I think we had one person of mixed race and maybe one or two Hispanic kids in our whole school. So I was just around people who looked just like me. And that's not a great way to grow up learning to understand people who aren't just like you.
The fights over guns, healthcare, education, and religion aren't just political, they're geographic. The left coast and the far west may both be part of California, but one is progressive and coastal with a desire to restrict gun rights and advance universal healthcare, while the other is libertarian and inland with a passion for low taxes and less government intervention
Yeah.
in their lives. Meanwhile, El Norte sees the border not as a dividing line, but as a zone of shared identity with Mexico.
Yeah, and this is why some of the current political issues that we have, for example, the issue of the border is such a contentious one, because for many of the people in this region here, they're a family on either side. And so they don't see it as this hard wall that should be separated, but they see it as something that kind of, they spread across. And this is also why you see movements from time to time in different areas for breaking away from a state. Because, for example, if you live in that kind of eastern part of California that doesn't vote the way the western part does, you're like, I feel like my voice isn't being heard. Let's start a new state.
Contrasted with Greater Appalachia, which sees the border as something that needs to be hardened and made less permeable.
Yep.
Meanwhile, the Spanish Caribbean, anchored in places like Miami and San Juan, functions with a bilingual, bicultural, Spanish-inspired rhythm distinct from anything in the Deep South or Yankeedom. None of this is just a cultural quirk. It affects the governance of each nation. Trying to craft one-size-fits-all federal policy in a country this fragmented is like trying to sew a quilt from 12 different fabrics using a single thread. You see it in the endless political gridlock, in states suing the federal government over mandates, in regions going their own way on issues like abortion, climate, and immigration.
And this is why it's so dangerous for us to think that the way that we think is the way everybody should think about a particular issue. Or for some of us, we're just our minds are just boggled by the idea that somebody could have a different view than ours. Because it seems to us, in our culture and in the place that we live, that that's the only right choice. But we are very, very different.
Culture wars aren't a glitch in the system. They're the system playing out across an invisible map that very few people acknowledge.
Yep.
But when you do acknowledge that map and see the United States as these 12 nations, it explains so much.
Yeah.
It explains why San Francisco, California and Los Angeles, California look and feel so different, or why New Orleans, Louisiana is so different from Mobile, Alabama, despite their geographic proximity. It explains why some states feel like they're being governed by outsiders. It also explains why unity is hard and why division comes so easily.
Yeah.
The idea of the United States as a single people has always been more aspiration than reality. What holds the country together isn't shared culture, but shared infrastructure. Roads, currency, federal programs, a military. But culturally and politically, the US operates more like a loosely bound confederation.
And this is why in times of national crisis, we seem so unified. So for example, when 9/11 happened, it felt like our country was very unified, or in World War II, for example. Why is that? Because we were focused on something that we did share in common. On 9/11, here in Northeast Ohio, New York didn't feel like a foreign place to me anymore. I had a shared identity with them because I was mourning for my fellow Americans who had lost so much and had seen such destruction. And I didn't focus on the fact that we were culturally very different. But then as time goes on, of course, you lose that again. And so when we have those moments of national crisis, we are able to unify behind something that does bind us all together.
Not red and blue, but a mosaic of nations that coexist, cooperate, compete, and sometimes clash. Understanding the country through this lens doesn't solve the problems, but it at least makes them less intimidating. In fact, it offers a way to reframe political conflict not as irrational partisanship, but as the natural friction between fundamentally different regional identities. And so, with all that said, if these nations did actually exist, what would they look like today? Which would be most populous, and which would be the
wealthiest?
wealthiest?
Cool. I like this idea of doing this.
If the United States were to break apart, not just politically, but culturally and geographically, it probably wouldn't fracture into red and blue states. It would likely splinter along the lines of these 12 nations, or something close to it. During that time, some would thrive, others would struggle, and a few would quickly seek alliances with the others to stay afloat.
Yep.
Yankeedom, with a population of nearly 58 million and a median income close to $57,000, would be a powerful nation.
Yeah.
It would inherit much of the intellectual, educational, and technological infrastructure of the Northeast and the Great Lakes. With elite universities, corporate headquarters, and deep ties to Canada and Western Europe, Yankeedom would function as a progressive, internationally oriented republic. Yankeedom would find a natural ally in the left coast.
Yeah.
A smaller nation in terms of population, but wealthier per capita and similarly forward-thinking in tech, sustainability, and civil liberties. A Yankeedom left coast alliance would be a powerful and progressive counterweight to the other blocs.
Somebody's going to need to turn this into a Hearts of Iron 4 scenario that we can play.
Greater Appalachia, on the other hand, would be one of the largest nations by population and land, but lower in income and higher in internal division.
You've got many of the poorest counties in America in that region.
Culturally rugged and libertarian leaning, it might resist federal-style unity altogether, opting instead for a loosely aligned federation or even full decentralization. After all, how do you tie Appalachia to Oklahoma and northern Texas? Culturally, it would likely have deep ties to the far west, another vast and sparsely populated nation, and could lead to a rural alliance focused on resource extraction, states' rights, and small government. The Deep South, with 45 million people and a median income below $44,000, would likely emerge as a conservative powerhouse with strong emphasis on tradition, religion, and business-friendly policies.
Makes sense.
Its historic distrust of centralized government might persist, but its internal cohesion would make it a formidable independent entity. It would also be the region with the highest African American population, perhaps shifting it politically in ways not expected. It could easily ally itself with Greater Appalachia and parts of the far west on cultural issues, forming a socially conservative coalition.
Here's the thing I would say, though, is that if you break that, let's say the Deep South, into its own independent nation, for example, right now we know that African Americans in huge numbers vote kind of as a bloc. They vote very heavily Democratic. You make them their own independent nation, and suddenly now the things that they are having in common might start to split, right? You know, you might start to focus more on the differences that you have, and so you might start to see a divide between African Americans on particular issues that are unique to their region that don't exist now.
Norte would be uniquely positioned. With over 34 million people, a relatively young population, and a bilingual workforce, it could become a bridge not just culturally, but economically, between North and Central America. Its economic strength would come from cross-border trade, agriculture, and a strong labor ethic. El Norte would likely partner with the Spanish-speaking Spanish Caribbean, which includes southern Florida and Puerto Rico. Though separated by geography, their shared language, religion...
But also, again, it's important to note that politically kind of different. I mean, southern Florida is, a lot of Cuban immigrants, and they tend to vote differently than, say, Mexican immigrants do.
And cultural foundations could build a pan-Caribbean coalition with strong ties to Latin America and Spain. New Netherlands, anchored by New York City, would be small in size, but a global giant in finance, media, and international diplomacy. With the highest population density, high income, and global reach, it would likely function more like a city-state such as Singapore. It would also have close ties to Yankeedom, though due to its status as a global center for finance and trade, it may wish to remain politically neutral overall. Speaking of smaller nations, Tidewater, with a relatively small and aging population, might find itself squeezed between the ambitions of its neighbors. Historically aristocratic,
You're Belgium
and now a region of
Tidewater.
retirees, it might depend on alliances with either the Deep South or New Netherlands for economic and political stability. The Midlands, straddling the cultural middle, would face a hard choice. Politically moderate with about 37 million people and middling income, it could swing either way, joining the Yankeedom Left Coast Progressive Coalition or partnering with the Deep South or Greater Appalachia for pragmatic reasons.
You would have, culturally, at least a part of all of that that's in Ohio and Western Pennsylvania is going to identify, I think, a lot with Appalachia more than Yankeedom.
Its fate might hinge on leadership and external pressure. Of all regions, the Midlands are the most likely to swing between the different nations. New France, with only about 3 million people, might also struggle to see where it fits in. New France would likely align with the Deep South, though culturally it stands apart in language, cuisine, and worldview. Of all nations, New France would leave the biggest question mark for how it would evolve as a nation. Finally, Hawaii would be small, but uniquely positioned geopolitically. Its high income and strong ties to Asia and the Pacific would make it a diplomatic and military keystone in the Pacific. While isolated, it could remain neutral, non-aligned, or form a Pacific alliance with the left coast. In raw numbers, the largest nations by population would be Greater Appalachia, Yankeedom, and the Deep South, while the smallest would be Hawaii, New France, and the Spanish Caribbean. The largest by area size would be the Far West, Greater Appalachia, and Yankeedom, while the smallest would be New Netherlands, Hawaii, and the Spanish Caribbean. The wealthiest per capita would be New Netherlands, Hawaii, and the left coast, while the poorest would be the Spanish Caribbean, the Deep South, and El Norte. Finally, the youngest would be El Norte, New France, and New Netherlands, while the oldest would be Hawaii, Yankeedom, and the Spanish Caribbean. If the United States were to divide, it wouldn't do so evenly. Power would consolidate around urban cores, ports, and cultural hubs, just like it does with every nation. Border regions might become flashpoints or bridges. Long simmering tensions could ignite or be resolved. But what's clear is this: a split United States wouldn't just be 50 smaller pieces. It would more likely become 12 vastly different nations, each with its own priorities, challenges, and sense of identity. And in some ways, it already is. The US is a single country, of course, but culturally, it is broken up into different nations. And honestly, you can say the same for basically every country that exists today. Speaking of different countries, this week I'm exploring the ancient ruins of the Khmer Empire's capital.
All right, so we'll wrap it up right there. That was really interesting. I enjoyed that video a lot. I know he put a lot of work and research into that, and it shows. That was really cool, but I would love to hear your thoughts about all of that. Let me know in the comment section below, and specifically talk about where you live if you're an American, or if you're from another country, how are you different than other parts of your own country? Let's learn from all of that together. Thanks for watching.